Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our 67th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. This is, I've grandiosely called it the first one of our autumn or fall, depending on your parlance, series of talks. We've got talks running all the way through to Christmas, basically, to the 17th of December. A lineup that includes a number of folk on the call today, so Alex Creamer and Bernd Frick, and a number of other very interesting looking talks in prospect, which I'm very excited about. We've been meeting now for well over 18 months while the pandemic's been on, and seeing as the pandemic still appears to be with us, and while there's still supply and demand for high quality sport economics research seminars, I'm quite happy to act as the go-between and make sure that these things happen. Today's talk is by Benedikt Schmal from the Heinrich-Heine-Universität at Düsseldorf, and he's presenting work titled The Long Shadow of an Infection, COVID-19 and Performance at Work. Benedikt has about 60 minutes to talk in, and then there's about 30 minutes time for Q&A. Both of his co-authors, of which I am one, are on the call. I saw Kai arrive a little while ago, and so hopefully if you have questions for clarification and you can see the chat, pop them in there and we can hopefully answer them there. If we can't, we will interrupt Benedikt. But otherwise, Benedikt will have about 60 minutes to present in, so plenty of time to present, plenty of time for Q&A. So Benedikt, please do take away your talk.
All right, thank you for this introduction. So then I'm gonna share my screen, my slides for screen mode. All right. So I hope every one of you can see the slides. I'm not able to see the chat, so as James has mentioned earlier, I cannot see the questions there, but I guess Kai and also James are gonna answer this, or I guess James is telling me the question if there's something really crucial. Yep. So let's jump directly into our work. As James already has mentioned, all three of us are here. Kai is another PhD student from Düsseldorf here, as I am, and James, you know, is the host of this seminar series. So let me directly start with a little disclaimer. This paper and this talk now is not a genuine sports paper or sports economics paper. And yeah, hopefully not all of the people have left now, because this is not a genuine sports paper because we think and we are convinced that this has really a general interest aspect, what we do here. But of course, we analyze sports data. So I'm pretty sure and I'm pretty confident that Roses is a great place to present our working paper and what we have done so far. So let me start with a little summary that provide you the main results and what we did. So we use, as mentioned, highly granular data from professional men's soccer in Germany and Italy. In Germany, it's the first Bundesliga, and in Italy, it's the Serie A. Methodologically, we apply a difference in difference setting to estimate the causal effects of a COVID-19 infection on performance at the workplace. And in our case, the workplace is the soccer pitch. And most important, what do we find? We find persistent negative effects at the intensive margin, meaning players who, conditional on having played, plays significantly worse. We do measure this by a performance measure as the number of passes, and I will explain why we use this measure. And performance is using this measure around 5% lower, and this even 6 months after being recovered and back on the field. And this is different to other injuries, as there are plenty in soccer, as you might know, and also different to other respiratory infections like the influenza or like a usual cold. The motivation is a somewhat trivial thing, because all of you know and all of you have faced to some extent COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences. So of course it has also a high economic impact by the shutdowns of economic activities. And also many people fear severe sickness due to a COVID-19 infection. And all of us have seen in the news these pictures of people being on these intensive care stations, which are really, really horrible pictures. But up to now, most economic research has focused on the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, abbreviated NPI. That means school closures, shutdowns, social distancing, or even curfews, which have been in place in France, for example, also for a few weeks in Germany. And there's many work out there and many really high names work on this. But our research is in that sense novel, that we study the persistent economic costs of the infection itself and not the measures taken to avoid being infected, what the non-pharmaceutical interventions actually do. The common goal of these NPIs is always avoid the spread of the infection, but we go one step further and say what happens when some person is actually infected. And as you may know, the numbers, there are millions of people out there in nearly every large country who has been infected. Of course, there's medical literature studying the so-called long COVID, which affects many people, many infected people months after an infection. But of course, medical literature does not focus so much on the performance at the workplace. And we do also analyze professional soccer because of the quality of the data and the physicality of the task. So many people ask us, why don't you analyze care work? Why don't you analyze office work? And those are really interesting and important job occupations. But on the other hand, productivity is quite difficult to measure there, and I will come to that. And also there's quite tough, it's hard to find data which tracks the productivity. So with professional soccer, we have a unique chance to study productivity. And furthermore, soccer is comparatively low hit by the pandemic. So quickly after the pandemic started, really in March, April 2020, the leagues proceeded with their seasons. And so we have a really good picture of what happened there. And of course, soccer is quite physical. And as you know, COVID-19 is a physical infection. It infects the lungs, it's a respiratory infection. So this is a great place to start this kind of research. All right, so there's not so much literature directly doing what we do. So we are quite novel here. But of course, there's adjacent literature in the field addressing several strands, which we also cover. So first of all, most of you are sports economists and might know why sports data are really useful for economic research, but still I want to re-emphasize this. So there is a paper by Bailey and co-authors who point out that sports economics are really great because we have such tremendous amount of data in professional sports, and we often have some kind of quasi-natural experiments or quasi-experiments, which are in that sense different to, for example, lag experiments, because now we have here high stakes, we have really invested players, which some people like Robert Orman, the Nobel laureate, they doubt for lab experiments where you gamble for €5, 10 euros, so to say. But here we have job occupations with players really being interested in reaching great results and putting all into the game, all into the match, what they can. And we have a wide range of economic fields that can be addressed with sports data, like the Cassis and co-authors paper, where also one co-author is Benedikt Schmal, who's also here today. And they test game theoretical hypotheses from industrial organization for the first mover advantage in research and development, and do this by analyzing penalty shootouts. And also in public and legal economics, there are really great and awesome papers out there. For example, the Kahn and Scherer paper, who study racial wage gaps in baseball between black and white baseball players. Cleveland et al., who study actually the effect of tax on migration. So does high taxes lead to people leaving the country, which is also an AR paper. So there's really in the top 5 journals we have research on sports data. And a last thing I want to mention is the Lichter paper, Lichter et al., because they have a really similar approach as we take, because they study performance on the pitch for professional soccer players and the impact of environmental pollution. On more detail, they study air pollution. They have air pollution data and then check how this affects the performance on the pitch. So there we have many parallels. Yeah, the second strand is productivity and economic research in the COVID-19 pandemic. There's so much out there, I just can mention a few which are related to productivity. We have the Bloom et al. Paper, who do a firm survey in the UK and find that total factor productivity declined by 3 to 5%. We have ambitious findings for productivity effects of the commonly used work from home schemes. So another UK study is done by Etheridge and co-authors, and they find no effect, but it's different. It's difficult to evaluate because they just rely on self-reports, on survey results, and people should evaluate themselves, which is always kind of tricky. And we have the Kühne and co-authors paper, and they study actually chess players and how they perform in chess tournaments and compare in situ tournaments with tournaments happening at home and via the internet due to the pandemic, and find a significant deterioration. And a bit similar is because this is in cognitive, more in the cognitive dimension, we have the Altindag study that find worse outcomes for learning from home compared to learning in school for school kids. So there's a lot of work done in the field, but, and I want to re-emphasize this, they study always this non-pharmaceutical interventions. They do not study COVID-19, they study like, what happens if we work from home? What happens if school kids stay at home? And not what does the sickness itself. And the last trend really directly addresses, of course, health sciences and mainly the work of on long COVID. So typical long COVID symptoms are chronic cough, shortness of breath, chest tightness, cognitive dysfunction, and extreme fatigue. And another study finds that nearly every second person between 60 and 30, so also quite young, has persistent symptoms even 6 months after the infection. One has to be a bit careful there because, again, one symptom might be a bit of cough, which is not really a tough symptom. So not all of them are completely knocked out, but we see there is something happening. And we see that hospitalized patients, which are, of course, quite a specific subsample of really severely affected people, have lower health level even 12 months after the infection is cured. So there's something going on, we can see this. And this is for us, of course, the motivation to look into this sickness in a bit more detail. All right, let me take a... Then let's have a look at the data. We have player and match data from Opta Sports. This is now part of the Stats Perform company, and it's the main data provider for many European soccer leagues. So there are official partnerships with the English Premier League, with the German Bundesliga, the Serie A, the Spanish La Liga, and those are the data like broadcasters like Sky use. Many teams use this to analyze their players, and we're pretty confident that those are the best data out there we can get. As mentioned before, we use Germany and Italy, and the seasons 1920 and 2021, which both begin in late summer and then in late spring or in early summer, depends on the weather in April and May. And for the COVID-19 infections, which is the crucial building block of our analysis, we have done together with research assistants a meticulous analysis of newspapers, online, of social media accounts of the official team. So we verified that this data is accurate and reliable. And we found 257 infections and could clearly identify 233 players. So we have a coverage above 90%. What is the missing data? So especially in later stages of the pandemic, many clubs decided to announce just we have 3 infected players, or we have 2 players infected and 2 of the staff, and they tried to hide the actual players. So It's sometimes a bit difficult to find this out. We asked of the clubs, but they did not tell anything because of data protection issues. But as we have really famous leagues, there's a lot of media coverage. There are often journalists observing every training session. So it was pretty good to find out, with a lot of research, of course, how which players were infected. So the infection data, we use this as the announcement of the infection as infection date. This is, of course, there's a bit of confusion there because it might be infected on Tuesday and tested on Wednesday or so, but we consider this as a reliable measure, as clubs tested several times a week and always before match day. So we can clearly make sure that the match day is correct. And lastly, we have data on injuries and infections of players besides COVID-19, and we obtained them from Transfermarkt, which is one of the world's largest platforms for these data. All right, so let me dig a bit deeper into the 2 countries we cover and explain you why we have chosen them. We see here the 7-day incidences in Germany and Italy. You have to be a bit careful with the indices on the left side, on the left axis, because Germany we have 200 as highest scale, and in Italy we have 400. So there's double the size. But what we can clearly see is a first wave, and the bold line is the infections in the overall population. The dashed line is the infections of the number of infected players, which is covered also on the right scale. So we do not have here more than 100 players, but more than 10. But we see example on the right-hand side for Italy, a really high share of players infected and people infected, and also in the second wave, a lot of players infected. Similar here to Germany with, of course, a lower scale and the first and second wave. So what does this tell us? First of all, infections of players follow the general pattern in the population, which makes us quite confident that we have here a reliable data set. And second, especially for Italy, we have the situation that there was a really severe hit of the pandemic, especially in the northern part of Italy in the early stages of the pandemic, such that the infected players provide us a really long timeline of post-infection information. Similar is this to Germany. Now we have less incidences and less infected players, but Germany started earlier to precede the league, their season. So Germany was the first country in the world with a top league in soccer to restart the season in May 2020. So again, we have really long time series here for post-infection data. Yeah, that's just a small graph to illustrate the places of the clubs. What's interesting is on the right-hand side is Italy. We see that many clubs are in the northern part of the country, and especially the northern part, the Lombardy, was really severely hit in the beginning of the pandemic. So this is the reason why we got in the slide beforehand this high figure here in the beginning. All right. Let me check briefly my notes. Great. Then let's proceed to the empirical strategy. What is our approach? So sports is an occupation with really low confounding of individual productivity. Because productivity in general, every labor economist knows this is to some kind of fuzzy term, and it's really hard to measure and to disentangle the different factors, especially on the individual level. So this is, as I've mentioned, the reason why we could not analyze care workers, workers in hospitals, office workers, because it's tough to track. And yeah, first of all, we did not have the data, and second, if we have the data, it's difficult to disentangle. So in soccer, we consider productivity as a function, an unknown function, but a function of various health aspects, and mainly physical measures like acceleration of the player, condition, endurance, but also the cognitive capability, what is often called the match intelligence, that players anticipate. That they anticipate where to stand, where to pass to, and how to play, so to always be in a good position to get passes, to receive passes, and to play passes. So this is the main measure of performance for us, the number of passes, because it's related to all productivity drivers. When you're not capable to go over 90 minutes, always be where the ball is, you play less passes. When you're not fast enough, you can play less passes because you're usually not there where the ball is when you're quite slow. And also the cognitive part, which is affected by COVID-19, when your match intelligence decreases to some extent, you also might be in less, in worse positions to receive a pass or to play a pass. So we think that the number of passes is a really good measure of productivity, and we're not alone with this. For example, the Lichter study has also done this, and several other papers use the number of passes. We have done robustness checks with the number of touches and possessions and find that the numbers are really similar. And what do we consider as the underlying mechanism? COVID-19 is a shock not directly to performance, but to the underlying health aspects. So it's a shock to condition, it's a shock to endurance, to acceleration. But this again, in the second step, leads to the deterioration in performance. Therefore, we measure this second step and look how do performance on the pitch at the workplace changes. So then let's dive directly into the econometric part and what we've done. So I've already mentioned it, and it's quite obvious to apply a difference in different setting for causal inference. We compare the pre and the post-infection outcomes for the infected players with pre and post-infection outcomes for not infected players. And here one has to pay attention because this is not this kind of Carton-Kruger textbook example before and after, but we have a highly staggered treatment because we have seen this in the plots. There are so many dates, points in time where players have been infected, such that there is not this kind of January 1 thing and July 1 where some treatment becomes effective. And we do identification via COVID-19 infections as an unanticipated exogenous shock, where players do not really can opt in and select into. And we are also considering this as exogenous because this is tough to expect. So we have two different estimation times. We have so-called basic static DID setting. On the left-hand side is the performance parameter, which is mainly the number of passes. We use the logarithm of the number of passes, but I will speak about the number of passes or passes for simplicity, but it's always the logarithm if I do not say anything else. And we have done this for robustness checks with touches and possessions. Then, of course, we have the beta parameter, which is the parameter of interest, the effect of COVID-19. And this is the dummy that one post-infection has been recovered from COVID-19. Then we have covariates, we have fixed effects, and of course the idiosyncratic error term. And in a minute, I will explain covariates and fixed effects further. In the second step, we do an event study setting. I've already mentioned we have really good data, really long time series. And now we split the post-infection data into several sections. We bin them and then estimate them over time. We use bins of 75 days. We've checked several bin sizes, larger and smaller, but they are mostly the same. All right. So let me say something to our estimation or continue here. First of all, we have player fixed effects, we have team season fixed effects, opponent season fixed effects, match day, and a fixed effect capturing the variation before and after the break in spring 2020, because there is some sports economic literature, for example, by Santana, that says that there has been a few changes in how players behave and how players act on the pitch. We have checked several combinations of the fixed effects and found our results to be really robust because, of course, the main effect is the player fixed effect. As covariates, we use the minutes played squared, the age of the player, the question whether it's a home or an away game, and whether it's a ghost game. Yeah, as estimation strategy, we use a two-way fixed effects model. And as you might know, there are a lot of recent advances in difference estimation for staggered treatment at the moment. So there are nearly monthly coming out new papers. Main papers are by Sun and Abraham or by Callaway and Santana, who question that two-way fixed effects is the right estimation strategy. And the main critique is that treatment effects might change over relative time to the treatment due to heterogeneity in real time. And our approach is solely based on relative time periods to an infection. We have always period the treatment and then before and after, but we do not have really a date because it's so staggered, and we do not do this kind of January 1, July 1, where new laws introduced, the new taxes introduced. So as we do a different approach, as like Callaway and Santana do in their correction models, we are still quite confident that the two-way fixed effects approach serves well for our estimation. And last but not least, what's also important is that we have no double treatment of players in our data set. So of course, we know from medical research that people can get infected twice or 3 times, but we do not observe this for our data set. And also, as a side note, we have no vaccinated players in our data set. So now we do a two-step approach. First, we estimate the extensive margin. So the likelihood that an infected player after he has recovered plays again, and the minutes he plays after his recovery. And in the second step, we look at the player on conditional on having played, how they perform, like the intensive margin. So let's start with extensive. We see on the left-hand side the likelihood to play, and on the right-hand side the minutes played. For both, we see more or less flat pretense, and we set a severe decline in the first bin. We see this here, and we see this here. So we have a significant negative effect. Also, the static effects are significant on a 1% level. But this is mainly driven by convalescence and by quarantine measures. Because what we also see is that quickly this part in the later stages, this extensive margin effect disappears. So the static effect is mainly driven by these figures here, and we do not find a persistency here. Second, we look at substitutions, and these substitutions lead us directly to the intensive margin. So we are still here in the extensive section, and we see on the left-hand side the likelihood to be substituted on the pitch. Means that you do not start, but enter the match later. And now we see here for a long time an increased likelihood. On the other hand, we see here not really a large effect for over time, on a persistent effect, but still, especially in the beginning, a positive effect for being substituted off. But especially the fact that one is substituted on could be a hint, and that leads us to the intensive margin, as mentioned, could be a hint that players are not able to go full time over the whole match. And could be a hint that players are only substituted on for the last 30 minutes, 20 minutes, because they are not able to go a full time. Until now, it's only a hint, but I will show you in a minute that there's more evidence. So the extensive margin takeaways are simply that we have an increasing likelihood to be substituted on and off, especially the substitute on. And our guess is that this is due to insufficient fitness due to COVID-19. On the other hand, which is also a fact, is that we have no persistence effects at the extensive margin, such that we have a return to initial levels over time. All right. So now I'm going to show you the heart of our paper, where we want to answer how recovered players perform conditional on being on the pitch. And as in most of the talks, you forget most of the topics covered, most of the topics discussed, but I hope that at least you take this graph home. This is the main takeaway, and I want to remember you this graph is one. If you have one takeaway, do this, because this is the effect on the intensive margin of COVID-19 on performance on the pitch, on performance at the workplace. We see a significant static semi-elasticity of minus 5.1%, which is highly significant. And we see a really persistent pattern of a deterioration of performance on the pitch. We find that there's even some decrease here, but in general we see that the lighter area is the 90% confidence interval, I'm sorry. The dark area is the additional 95% interval. And we see that after being infected with COVID-19, a player never, in our data set, of course, in our sample, never returns to initial levels of performance on average. Of course, we estimate here an average treatment effect of the treated, such that there might be players returning quickly to the initial level, other players being completely knocked out. But on average, we have a deterioration by 5%, which is really significant over more than half a year. We also see here, before the treatment, flat trend trends, such that we are pretty confident that our findings are reliable. We have also some robustness checks done with touches and possessions, as you might know, and those show a similar pattern here. Of course, they vary a bit, but again, we have in the same ballpark here, minus 4.7%, minus 3.7%. And the same is true if we vary the specification from the logarithm, like to levels here, or here we do the hyperbolic sine transformation to solve the problem with the zero values dropping out. And always we see a significant deterioration, which is persistent. We do not find a persistent deterioration. We also find heterogeneity in many dimensions of this effect. We have picked two effects here, or two dimensions. First of all, the age, and second, the length of the rest break between two matches. And we have here three categories for age: younger than 25, younger or equal than 25, 26 to 30 years, the second column, and the third column, older than 30 years. And while for young players, aged less than 25, we find an insignificant effect, this effect really worsens over time for older players. We find here an effect of less than 10% compared to before, as for players being older than 30. And this is really a tremendous effect in age, or tremendous variation in age. And we also find, which is quite reasonable, differences in the length of the rest breaks. So there are weeks in which are 3 weeks and 7 days. If you have a match on Sunday, say, then within a week on Wednesday or Tuesday, and then again on Saturday or Sunday. So really short rest breaks, and they lead to the highest decrease in the match. So for short rest breaks, the effect is lower. For large rest breaks, it gets insignificant. Here is 12 to 14 days, and this is larger than 14 days. So we also see that especially the performance under pressure, so when there is really players working on the edge, getting at the margin, we see this deterioration. All right. So now, up to now, we have seen a lot of effects. We have seen there is a persistent decline. But what if we discuss here a phenomenon that is typical for injuries or other types of infections? So what maybe this persistent decline is to some extent normal. especially in professional sports, which are really high pressurized occupations. So what we did is we used the transfer mark data on injuries and infections and compared them with a COVID-19 infection. And I show you now the results, which really show that COVID-19 is a unique threat to your own performance. So let's first have a look on the left-hand side. Here we see three lines. In this one plot, we have the same bin size. We see the red line with the red shaded area is the same graph as I've shown you for the intensive margin, just a bit smaller here on this slide. And we have two pretty similar lines here in green and blue. And green are short injuries, which causes a player to skip at most 2 matches. And a blue line for long injuries, for injuries that last for more than 2 matches. Why do we divide this at this point? We see that 2 matches is the median because many injuries are just short ones and lead to short breaks of players. And what we see, they are pretty parallel, but what we mainly see is that there is no significant effect. So after an injury, either a short or a long one, when players return to the pitch, they are fit again. They're fit as on their initial levels, on average. Compared to this, we have COVID-19. You see this graph, I've shown you this, we have this persistent decline. So this is really the main difference to the normal injury, so to say. And then, as COVID-19 is a respiratory infection, we also looked at other respiratory infections. We've looked mainly at the cold, a normal cold, or at the flu. And you might remember, I don't know if it has been in your country, but in Germany, there were many people claiming, especially in the beginning of this pandemic, that COVID-19 is just a flu. Not from the science, but many in public policy and in the public debate were claiming this. There were loud voices, maybe a minority, but a loud minority. And here we see that for our parameter of interest, there's big differences. I mean, we have seen this of course, in the medical literature, but here we focus on our point of research and our issue. And we see that with the blue line, the blue area are respiratory infections. And after a flu, people are on average not different, perform not different to pre-infection times. We have here quite high confidence intervals. That is due to the lower power of our data set because there are not so many reported flus and colds in the data set. But we see clearly that the effects are different. And we see again, this is the same plot here and there. We see persistent effects of COVID-19 and not persistent effects of the flu, of the cold, which is quite reasonable because if there would be persistent effects, negative effects, this would have been in the media, that would have been discussed because so many people get the cold in a year, get a flu in normal years. This would be an issue. But here is another proof that COVID-19 is in a really bad sense, but is unique. So due to the granularity of our data, we can go into even more detail than match day data. We have, as I've mentioned, Opta data, and they track every action on the pitch. So every pass, every touch of the ball, every foul, everything is recorded. We have we have it on the second. They measure the minute and the second. We have also the coordinates we do not really use, but we have X and Y coordinates on which point on the pitch the players are. And as we have data over time and not just a summary of the match, we know when a player plays a pass. If it's in the first minute, in the 30th minute, in the 90th minute. And so we have seen this deterioration on the intensive margin. And looking at the data, we see that this perfectly fits in our hypothesis that a player cannot go over 90 minutes, cannot go full time. And we see that it occurs at the margin. So what did we do? We separated a 90-minute match into 6 bins, into 6 bins of 50 minutes each. And there we see this effect here. That's the last column is a bit larger than just 50 minutes because we put into minutes 76 to 90 also extra time, like 3 to 4 minutes extra time is also put in this bin here. And what do we see? We see a persistent negative effect from the first minute on the pitch on. But of course, we see this deterioration, which goes even further than 5% the longer a match lasts and the longer a player is on the pitch. The last big issue we analyze and we discuss is the issue of team spillovers. So soccer is, of course, a discipline played in teams, as most of the jobs nowadays. So most of the jobs work in teams. You know this from academic research, but also everywhere. In the factory, in a supermarket, in many office jobs, people work together. And less performance by one recovered player could have 2 spillover effects, or let's rephrase it a bit better. The formulation here is a bit odd. Less performance by one recovered player could have 2 effects or cause 2 effects to reactions by the team. So first of all, teammates could overcompensate the decrease in individual performance. One can, for example, imagine an office job in public administration or so, and one worker has a sick kid, and the sick child, he or she just leaves the workplace earlier to care for his or her child. And then the other co-workers say, okay, I do your work, I cover this. And maybe because they also want to finish their job on time after an 8-hour shift, they say, okay, let's scale up performance and we compensate for this. We do the job for a co-worker for this afternoon, or maybe for a week when they have a sick child. And the same could happen on a pitch. If one player plays worse, the other players could move more, could run more, could try to compensate this. On the other hand, teammates could suffer from the decrease in individual performance, because if one player plays less passes, other players receive the ball maybe less. Other players cannot completely compensate because a player is an integral part of the team. We see this when one player gets a red card and leaves the pitch. There is someone missing. Of course, COVID-19 is not a red card, but we see this as some kind of, you can say it as partial red card, because there's a fact that a player plays not so good anymore. So we try to measure this with the variable COVID exposure, we abbreviate with CE, as the share of recovered players of a team. So if we have, say, a team size of 25 players and we have 1 recovered player covered by the term post-infection, we have a CE of 4% over 1, or 1 over 25. And this variable is pretty simple. One can see this. That's just simple math. There's nothing sophisticated behind it, but it captures extensive and intensive margin effects. Why? Imagine, we have this not in the data, but imagine Robert Lewandowski has got COVID-19 for Bayern Munich, and now he misses a match. Basically, the COVID exposure on the pitch is 0, because 0 post-infected players are on the pitch because Robert Lewandowski is not participating. But they might still play worse because he's missing and replaced by a worse striker who's not so well in scoring goals. So COVID exposure captures this, missing players, but also players being on the pitch and playing worse. So what did we find? We see here for COVID exposure quite, a bit difficult to handle. Because what do we have here? We have some kind of really nonlinear effect. We splitted the data into 4 equal quartiles, with here as reference point 0 COVID exposure. Of course, the effect is 0. And then we have the 4 quartiles. First of all, keep in mind that COVID exposure is a share, so it's scaled from 0 to 1. And the only significant effect occurs in the fourth quartile, which is in the range of 0.24 or 24% and 100 or 1. One, of course, is a theoretical measure because there's no team in our data set, and I guess at all, who has 100% recovered players. This is also can be seen by the mean, which is really close to the lower bound with a mean of 35%. And for this fourth quartile, with a mean of 35% post-infected players, we find a deterioration in performance by 7%. And this is actually, it's not a big deal, but it's not nothing. Why? If we have 7% deterioration already for, say, 1/3 of infected players of a team, then this should, if we extrapolate this, we do not know how to extrapolate this because there is no data, but if we extrapolate this, when 100% are infected, this should be far above 7%. But if we had no team spillovers, we should expect that 11 players on the pitch, roughly, this is a rough estimation, but or back of the envelope estimation, but 11 infected players should lead to a team effect of 5%, because the individual effect is 5%, but one individual is just 1/11 as a part of a team. And even if you expect that some players are sometimes not part of the starting 11, this gets even more fuzzy. But what we can see is that we have 7% already for 1/3 of recovered players, which should really be a strong hint for team spillovers. So we are really pretty confident to say there is something going on. There are negative spillovers. Infected players affect non-infected players negatively in their performance. We have another graph which shows this in a bit more detail and shows that there is something going on. It's not tremendous, but there is something going on. This is again the within mesh performance I've shown you previously for the individual player level and now the team level. 1 second. So what do we see here? First of all, this graph is a bit tough, and I think we should replace it by a better one. Let's see. But let's look at the static semi-elasticity, which is pretty big. We have 0.199, so 20%, but we have a change of COVID exposure by 1. So a marginal change of 1, which is actually from 0 to 100%. And so we have to scale this down, because the average effect, when we have the average team size is around 26 players, and when one additional player is affected, this is a change of COVID exposure by 1/26 or 3.8% and not 100. So we have to rescale this, but it's still more than just this 5% level for the individual level. On the other hand, we see that's only significant on the 10% level. This is also, that makes us confident that the team spillovers are not completely out of scale and not completely worsening a team. And we would also have noticed this when there would be extreme team spillovers. And the last point, which perfectly fits in the picture, is that we see here especially no effects in the first part of the match. This is the first half, the first 45 minutes here, but only in the second half of the match, if at all. And why are these team spillovers important? With difference in differences, we assume a partial equilibrium effect. We assume that the treated individuals, no matter what their treatment is, we assume that the treated individuals do not affect the untreated ones. So clearly, there is not the biggest one. We have this kind of significance problem here, but there is some confounding due to affected players having a negative impact of not affected, untreated players in the control group. But actually, this makes us more confident for our core finding, because what happens when we have the control group being negatively affected, or at least slightly negatively affected, our difference in performance is actually downward biased. So the 5% we estimate are likely to be the lower bound of the effect because the control group is also a little bit affected by this negative spillovers. So actually, this strengthens our findings because this little teeny spillovers make sure that the 5% are the lower bound and that it might be even larger the effect if we would have non-infected players, what we actually do not can analyze. So we are now pretty sure that given our data and looking there is something going on with COVID-19. There's something big going on, to be honest. Maybe you say 5%, that's not so much. Why should we care? But 5% for the really young part of the population, an extremely fit part of the population, is something that should concern us. And this leads me now to the end of my presentation. And I want to quickly wrap up. So our question was, what is the effect of a COVID-19 infection on performance at the workplace? We study a really particular subgroup of society, but also a subgroup which might be a lower bound in terms of because they're so young, so fit. And we find temporary effects, only temporary effects on the extensive margin, which are not so surprising because the large negative effect is mainly due to convalescence and quarantine obligations following a COVID-19 infection. So this is pretty simple, and this is that's not surprising. But what is surprising, what is crucial, is the significant and also persistent deterioration on the intensive margin. We find a static difference in difference effect of -5.1% being persistent over more than 6 months. I don't want to focus too much on these 5%. I mean, it could be 5.5, it could be 6, it varies over time. And as I've mentioned, the spillovers lead to a lower bound. But there is something definitely going on. We find heterogeneous effects for age and rest breaks, which perfectly fit. At COVID-19, our productivity declines are at the margin. When the rest breaks are shorter, the effect is larger. When players are less fit due to their age, the effect is larger. And the findings are pretty robust to variations in the performance measures. They're robust for a level specification or hyperbolic sign transformation. So we studied a lot of variations. We varied the fixed effects. We varied a lot of stuff in our model, and you can find this in our paper. And we always find more or less the same. The results are always in the same ballpark. And as mentioned, the negative spillover effects might be a hint that we underestimate the true effect size. So at the very last point, what are our policy implications? So all of us three, James, Kai, and me, we are not medical researchers, we are not politicians, we are not sociologists, we are economists, or at least Kai and I are on the way to become economists. But we see in the world millions of infected people. We see in Germany 4 million infected people. We see in the UK several million infected people. I do not have the exact number. In the US, so many people have been infected and recovered. And this should accumulate to some overall economic effect. This is not like the flu, where people are sick and tied to their bed for 5 days, for 7 days, but then return. Maybe on the first day at work after the flu, you are a bit weak, but on the second day, you are back on track. We find here persistent negative effects. And we think this should be included into cost-benefit analysis of non-pharmaceutical interventions. To decide about non-pharmaceutical interventions like shutdowns, like curfews, like homeschooling, work from home, is always a multidimensional issue. And we do not dare to answer and to know what to do here or there. But we think that it's important to include the problem of people getting infected and having performance, productivity declines afterwards. We think that this is a severe issue, this is a significant issue, and we think that should be taken care for by politicians. And this is also the bottom line of our paper. I hope it was interesting for you. That's from my side. That's from our side. I think I've met the time constraint roughly. I think, yeah, 5 minutes. So now, thanks a lot for your attendance. Thanks a lot for your listening. And now I'm happy to discuss any questions which might have not been answered in the chat in the meantime. Thanks.
Thank you, Benedikt. Very good presentation, as you say, kept very well to time, very clear as well. Thank you very much. There's been a few questions which I'm just going to pass by you and Kai the answers to, because I put stuff in the chat, but basically Peter asked first off about the distance that players run on the field, and that is a measure that we have used as a robustness measure, if I'm not mistaken, and I presume that we've got a table in the paper, do we?
Yes. Let's have a look. So yes, let's. I have not shown this. I have this here in the appendix of my slide. So we see here several alternative extensive and intensive margin outcomes we have looked at. Of course, we have some insignificant measures, but you see here the distance measure, and it's clearly negative. And all of the confidence bands are now here again on the 95% level. So we see that this is negative as well and negatively affected. That's the same on the extensive margin, whether player plays full time. We also have here really negative effect, and also which corresponds to full time, whether players in the starting 11, which is also negative. Thanks for this question. Yes.
Great, thanks, Benedikt. Then Alex has asked about player and team per season fixed effects. Now, are fixed effects there for players and for teams, or are they player per team fixed effects? Sorry, player per season fixed effects.
So we have player fixed effects, and not by season, but we have team and season, teams times season fixed effects, and opponent times season to capture the variation, also the strength of the team in the different season, because this can of course vary. And we have the match day fixed effects. So of course we have this kind of a player performance maybe worse on the 34th match day or then on the first or second match day.
Okay, thanks, Benedikt. Alex, you're welcome to come back on that if you still have any queries or concerns about that. He says it's okay, so we'll move on. Peter had a second query, which was whether we considered using the 18-19 season as a cleaner control group, since 19-20 season was affected by the break and the ghost games. As far obviously we haven't done that, but in principle we can, since we do have the 18-19 Opta data that we could make use of in principle as a control group.
Yes, yeah, that's a good suggestion. We could look at this as well. Yes, that's a point we will definitely discuss in the aftermath of this presentation. Thanks for the suggestion.
Great, and Peter's got his hand up, so go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, thank you, James. Thank you, Benedikt. I really enjoyed that. I put my hand up only because the slide that we currently see, I just got a question relating to the covariates. So obviously you spend a lot of time in the presentation talking about controlling for age, and obviously I think that's quite right to do that. I'm just thinking whether you control for other player demographics, so the ethnicity or nationality of the players. Obviously we hear a lot about maybe the impact of COVID potentially varying across different ethnicities. So I don't know how much variation you have in terms of the ethnicities of the infected players across the two countries, but I wonder whether that could be another another kind of confounding effect that you might want to consider?
Yes, of course, one can always discuss the set of covariates, and we also discussed a lot about which covariates to include and which to exclude. But my first guess is thinking about nationality. I would not know why we should include this, because the player play in Italy or play in Germany, regardless whether their passport says where they come from, and as they most of the time spend in the country, they're mostly affected where they live, so in Germany or Italy. And also we had this kind of travel bans, a lot of travel bans, so people could not return to their home countries for a long time. So I would not know how this should significantly affect or change the results, to be honest.
What about the ethnicity of the players? I mean, obviously, I take your point about the nationality, which is probably less difficult to explain, but maybe I don't know, the ethnicity of the player. I don't know. Again, I guess you must have information within the sample of players who have got COVID, in terms of their ethnic background, for example. I guess the thing with the nationality was, maybe I'm also thinking about their experience of playing within that league. So if they're a recent arrival to that league, that could also affect the performance, because they're adjusting to the style of play of that league. So that might be another factor, maybe to think about.
Well, I mean, I guess we have most of the issues covered by player fixed effects.
Yeah, I mean, I think ethnicity was probably going to be quite tricky to get hold of, other than going through each of the players and some kind of crude attempt to judge what it is. We certainly would have nationality, and a quick look at the Opta data says that we've got the player heights as well. But these are kind of the additional demographics that we might have for the players. Okay, well, thanks, Peter. If anyone does have any further questions, or indeed, if you want to come back, please do raise your hands and feel free to make points. Ian Gregory-Smith has his hand up.
Hiya. So this is a bit a cheeky one because James sent me the paper earlier, so I got to read it and have a little think about it before I heard your presentation. But there was one thing in the paper that I thought was strange, which was that you mentioned that when you came to look at the team effects, that there was no sort of significant effect on goals scored or points scored. So despite finding this effect on passing, which you think is important, then that didn't translate over to an effect on what we all care about, which is winning the game or getting points in the game. So I thought that was very interesting, because that suggests that, well, okay, your individuals are getting affected in your team. If you're thinking about a general workplace, you might not be so bothered about this, because okay, the individuals are affected, but somehow the team is coping. We're able to adjust our strategy. We're able to cope with the fact that we've got fewer passes on the pitch because we don't lose the games. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, thanks for asking this, and thanks for mentioning this, because we have discussed this, and that's definitely a point to think about. But our understanding of this is that goals and even more points are highly multidimensional outcome. So it's really driven by many factors. On maybe a goal can be scored due to really good passing, but it can also be scored through a penalty, through a corner, something else. And due to this many factors that drive a goal, and of course a point, because points, you can get 3 points by a 4-0 or a 1-0. So we are not that concerned because there are millions of possibilities how teams can reach a goal, can score a goal, or can get points. That there is some kind of transmission mechanism. So COVID affects the individual player affects the team, but this is somehow staggered in the sense that it's some kind of trickle down, and it loses its effect. I think the more dimensions impact an outcome, and therefore we are maybe a bit concerned about goals, but not concerned about points at all. But even for goals, we think that our findings on individual level do not, or the insignificant finding for goals does not invalidate our findings for the individual level. Because goals are so multidimensional. How a goal can be scored. Sorry.
Yeah, I wasn't saying it was invalidating a finding in any way. No, I mean, I totally buy the drop in passing performance. I mean, if anything, I'm surprised it's not more. But I just thought it was interesting that the team must have some kind of strategy the players on the pitch must have some kind of strategy for coping with this diminished performance on the pitch that allows them not to lose. Right, so they must be doing something. I mean, I did see that your passing accuracy, there wasn't a deterioration in passing accuracy. So maybe that they realize that they can't do as much passing in general, but when they are making their passes, they're still as successful as they were before. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting side of the story, particularly in terms of sort of the general economic implications for firms. The other thought I had was whether it is about the mechanism, whether it's not to do with the disease at all, but was it to do with the quarantine period that they faced? So as James knows, I have a notorious co-author who is super anti-lockdown or anti-COVID measures in general. So he might say, well, no, it's not it's the disease, it was the lockdown, it was the quarantine, the restriction that they had that has caused this long-term impact on their performance. Can you distinguish between the effect of the disease and the effect of being locked down for 2 weeks?
So that's a good point. We cannot distinguish between the disease and the quarantine phase, or this waiting period until you can return on the pitch or return into exercise. But what we see is when we compare it to other injuries, we also have this long phases of being, there's no quarantine, of course, but people returning slowly to the pitch and having long phases of being not in exercise, and we do not find this effect. It's true, it's not directly the same, because if you have an injured ankle or so, it means that there is some other effect going on. But we see for other injuries and infections, obviously the input factor of being not in exercise, being not so fit, waiting to return to the training on the training pitch and to the pitch in general. So we think that, so we cannot directly just entangle the quarantine and
I wonder, was there anybody who was quarantined not because they were infected, but because they had contact? Could you get at it that way? So they had a close contact and they had to be quarantined. Is that in the data? So they weren't infected themselves, but they had to be quarantined because they were, I don't know, hanging out with the infected people. Do you have anyone like that?
Okay, I understand what you mean. So we do not have this in the data, and we cannot now cannot say anything on the spot on this. We will think about this, but as far as I know, at least for Germany, players people could test, and if they had a proven negative PCR test, they could state that they had a close contact, of course, but they could end the quarantine earlier.
I see.
So I would say there is not so much confounding.
What's the system been in Germany and Italy in terms of players moving countries? And so in the UK we have a red list. A number of players who are currently away on international duty will come back and they then may well, if the country that they've gone to play in is on a red list, have to then wait a further 10 days before they play. That's, I don't know if there's anything similar in Germany or Italy over the time period such that we could use the international breaks.
I mean, yes, we could have a look at this issue. I mean, there were not so many like international matches like on the national matches.
Yeah.
I do not have a clear answer on the spot, but yeah, I will take a note and I will look at this in more detail. But I think it's at most it would be a minor issue. So what we know from many players is that beside matches, like private traveling was really restricted, not necessarily often by the government, of course, or by de facto restrictions, because no plane goes to your home country or to where you want to go on holidays. There is no point, and you can't get there even though it's allowed. But also many clubs were really interested in players not traveling around all the time, and had a close eye on this. So besides international matches, there was not really much traveling of the players.
Yep. And just on your earlier point, Ian, another, in terms of the effect on goals and points, another way of, I guess, of explaining that, and Benedikt can correct me, I think the effect was negative but insignificant on goals. Is that right, Benedikt?
So can you repeat this?
So the effect, we've got the negative effect on passing, but then looking at the overall effect on match outcomes, the effect was negative but insignificant.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And that, one explanation for that would of course be that goals are much lower frequency compared to passes, and so therefore if you've got that lower frequency of goals taking place, that might well explain the fact that the effect is then insignificant. Or at least kind of, I'm not trying to think, I can't think of the exact mechanism there, but you get a goal, by one way or another, and you win that game 1-0, and obviously, teams can come together, change strategy, and so on to ensure that they win that game 1-0, whereas they might have won it by more, or they might still win it by 1-0 if they weren't affected. And also, Ian, it makes me think, because you weren't associated with it, but I think David Payton was associated with the paper on LBWs in cricket. To do with international umpires, where you had an effect on LBW, but not on the actual match outcomes.
Yeah.
But thank you, Ian. Any more questions, comments? Peter had his hand up, but then he ducked it down again. I don't know if that's because it was answered. Peter, you jump back in.
I was going to ask the question that Ian raised about the players that had to isolate because they were deemed close contacts of the infected players. But I think that's something maybe to explore. But I think Benedikt's probably right in terms of if there might be some variation across the countries, maybe they could come out of the isolation period if they had a double negative test, or they just made up a test of their own.
Yeah.
Get back and try again.
Thanks, Peter. Sebastian has his hand up.
Yes, so sorry, I have a bad connection today, so I might have missed that. My question is, if I remember correctly, there have been teams who went to quarantine. So maybe they were in contact with COVID cases, even so not everybody was infected, so the whole team went into quarantine. Is there a way that you can check that in your data and maybe include that in your analysis? And maybe more specifically, can you in general check whether people get really infected or were just going into quarantine without being infected? So can you separate the two effects? And I'm sorry when you have said I missed the talk.
Thanks for the question. I haven't said this, so it's not due to your connection. I mean, actually, we do not have in the data. We could add this in a second kind of analysis of the news, which teams were at which time and in the quarantine. But we have this not in the data when whole teams were in quarantine. We do not consider this as a major effect because teams being in quarantine means that they could proceed with the training sessions. They were just separated from their families, their friends, but they were in a hotel and could proceed. So the sports performance should not be affected. Maybe there are really indirect channels of saying, okay, you may miss your family and then you have deteriorated performance, but this would be quite far-fetched. So I do not think that there should be a performance effect due to teams being completely quarantined, because they still proceeded with the usual training sessions, other than when one player was isolated and quarantined by the government, by local authorities.
Okay, thanks, Benedikt. Thanks, Sebastian. Any more questions and comments? Peter.
I started typing and then it was getting a bit long, so I thought I'd perhaps ask the question instead. So I wonder whether there was, how much variation there was in infected players across the teams. I know you mentioned in one of the earlier slides about obviously the northern region of Italy being, just in general, being particularly a hotspot area, and obviously that presumably would translate to more infected players for the teams playing in those regions. But I just wonder whether in general across the two countries there were some teams, apart from geographical reasons, where there was higher levels of infections compared to others, and whether this translates to potential differences between the bigger teams and the small teams, because obviously the bigger teams would be able to maybe kind of soften that, maybe kind of maybe able to adjust their team strategy as a consequence of that, rest the players more. Maybe those players play fewer minutes because they know they're coming back from the infection. So I just wonder whether you can say anything in terms of what your data is telling you in relation to that, and whether that's something you might have controlled it in the fixed effects, but I'm just interested to see whether there's anything else you can kind of tease out from that.
Yes, so you have already given the answer. So we try to control this, or to capture this with team season fixed effects, to capture the different maybe team quality kind of thing. But we can look into the descriptive data again, which teams are more affected, and maybe there's points scored. Unfortunately, I cannot provide any descriptive information now on the spot from the data, but we definitely have the data. We can look at it. Econometrically, we capture this by team season fixed effects, the differences or potential differences.
Are the overall numbers, it was about, what did you say, 230 odd was there in total in terms of infect? Was that reasonably equal across Germany and Italy, or was it skewed towards more the Italian league?
So Italy had a few more infections. Of course, also the Italian league has 2 more teams in the Serie A than Germany, but there was a bit skewed to Italy. However, we do not have this in this presentation now, but we've checked both countries separately, and they have the same effects. They differ, of course, a bit, but it's in the same ballpark. Yeah, it's a bit skewed towards Italy due to more teams, and because the numbers you've seen is in the incidences were higher. We have more Italian players there. Yes, that's true.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Benedikt. Still time for more questions and comments if folk have any. Okay, well, long pause. So I think we'll interpret that as no more questions and comments. Thank you very much, Benedikt. Obviously, I think I speak on behalf of Kai and myself and Benedikt in saying that if you do have questions and comments, we're more than happy to get them also via email as well. And if the paper is online, discussion paper both in Düsseldorf and in Reading, so please do get in touch if you have any questions and comments for us. We'll be delighted to get them. But thank you, Benedikt, for a very interesting, very clear talk. And we will return next week when Bernd Frick will be presenting the impact of team size on performance in the absence of shirking, clean evidence from elite rowing contests. So we move to rowing next week. But thank you once again, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.
All right, thanks also from my side.